All right, so you wanted to know what a second Trump term might look like, and luckily we've got some pretty interesting source material to dig into.
Yeah, really interesting.
We're talking about a recent in-depth interview. It's actually a YouTube interview with Trump himself.
Oh, wow, a YouTube interview.
I know, right? Not exactly your typical policy rollout, but that's what makes this so fascinating. We're getting his unfiltered thoughts, his plans, his vision for the future straight from the source.
It's like a rare glimpse behind the curtain.
Exactly. And he doesn't waste any time getting to the issues that were really central to his last campaign and seem to be still top of mind, the border and crime.
And he doesn't mince words, does he?
No, no, he does not. He comes right out and says that the U.S. is becoming a dumping ground for other countries' criminals and mentally ill populations.
He actually claims that jails and mental institutions are being emptied into the U.S.
Yeah, and he wants to send all criminals and people from mental institutions back to their home countries, regardless of their legal status.
Hmm. That's a pretty hardline stance, isn't it?
Yeah. It is. It raises a lot of questions. Like, is there any evidence to support his claims about this influx of criminals and individuals with mental illnesses?
And what about the legal and logistical complexities of mass deportation? Just a lot to unpack.
There is. And then he proposes a solution for illegal immigration and drug trafficking. He says he's got the answer: tariffs.
In fact, he calls tariffs the most beautiful word.
He loves tariffs. He sees them as a kind of a silver bullet.
He even specifically mentions a potential 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada.
25%, imagine that.
Whoa.
And he tells the story about calling the Border Patrol after threatening tariffs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they supposedly told him there's nobody here. So he uses this anecdote as proof that his tariff tactics work.
It's a good story, but does it really prove anything?
Well, that's up for debate, I guess.
Yeah.
But what are the potential economic and diplomatic consequences of these kinds of tariff threats? Could they backfire and lead to trade wars or damage our relationships with key allies?
Those are some important questions to consider.
Definitely. And speaking of the economy, he also talks about his economic plan in detail.
So what's the plan?
It all revolves around extending those Trump tax cuts. You remember those?
Yeah, those were a big deal during his first term.
Right. And of course, he wants to double down on tariffs. He really believes they are the key to a strong economy.
So no surprise there.
Not at all. He even argues that tariffs didn't actually cost Americans anything and that they led to a booming economy before COVID hit.
That's a controversial claim.
It is. He cites examples like Whirlpool, claiming that tariffs on washing machines actually saved jobs in Ohio.
I've heard that argument before.
Yeah, he also argues that tariffs can help pay down the national debt and prevent countries like China from taking advantage of the U.S.
So he sees tariffs as this win-win solution.
Exactly. But do economists agree with this assessment?
That's a good question. There are many different schools of thought in economics, and Trump's views on tariffs represent just one perspective.
Right. And what about the potential impact of tariffs on consumer prices and global trade relations? These are important factors to consider.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have to look at the whole picture.
Okay, so let's move on to an issue that affects a lot of people directly: the minimum wage.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Trump actually acknowledges that the federal minimum wage is low, but he also expresses concern about raising it too high.
Makes sense. There's a lot of debate about the potential impact of a higher minimum wage.
Exactly. He worries about negative consequences for businesses. He even shares this anecdote about restaurants in California going out of business because of the state's higher minimum wage.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and he even links California's population decline to its minimum wage policies.
And Joe, he's connecting those two issues.
He is, but then he says he might work with governors to find a solution.
So maybe a more collaborative approach.
Maybe. But it seems like he's trying to find this balance between acknowledging the need for a livable wage and addressing concerns about the impact on businesses.
It's a tricky issue to navigate, for sure.
It really is.
Mm.
And then he briefly mentions Jerome Powell, the current Fed chair, the Federal Reserve.
At the Central Bank of the United States.
Yeah, so he says he could replace Powell, but he doesn't plan to.
That's interesting. The president has the authority to appoint the Fed chair, so that's a pretty significant power dynamic.
It is. And it raises questions about his economic priorities and how he views the role of the Fed.
Definitely something to keep an eye on.
Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about another one of his core campaign promises: tackling illegal immigration.
This was a major focus of his first term.
Absolutely, and he doesn't shy away from it in this interview. He doubles down on this issue, emphasizing the need to deport anyone who entered the country illegally, regardless of their circumstances.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
It is, and he even suggests sending entire families back together if they choose to stay with a family member who's undocumented.
So he's taking a firm stance on family unity in this context.
Yes, but it's a shift from his earlier position on family separation. Remember that?
I do. That was a very controversial policy.
It was. And he also reiterates his promise to end birthright citizenship.
Birthright citizenship. That's a big
It
one.
is! It's the principle enshrined in the 14th Amendment that anyone born on U.S. soil is automatically a U.S. citizen.
Right. And he believes he can circumvent this amendment through executive action.
Which raises some major legal and ethical questions.
Absolutely. Like,
Mhm.
is mass deportation even feasible considering the resources and logistics involved?
Right. And is it ethically justifiable to uproot people who've built lives here regardless of their legal status?
These are tough questions with no easy answers.
Definitely. But here's a twist. Trump also expresses sympathy for dreamers.
Dreamers. Those are individuals who were brought to the U.S. illegally as children.
Exactly. And he seems open to working with Democrats on a plan to allow dreamers to stay in the U.S. legally.
That's a more moderate stance than he's taken in the past.
It is. It's a glimmer of hope, but can he realistically find common ground with Democrats on this issue?
That remains to be seen given the current political climate.
It's a good question. Okay, now let's move on to healthcare, another hot-button issue.
Always a big topic in American politics.
Trump makes some intriguing, if somewhat contradictory, statements about his healthcare plans.
Like what?
Well, for example, he claims he saved Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act.
Right, by making it work.
Right, but he still wants to repeal and replace it with something better.
That's what he's been saying for years.
It is. He assures us that pre-existing conditions will still be covered and prices will go down under his plan, but he doesn't give specifics.
So how does he plan to achieve that? It's a mystery.
It really is. It's a puzzle that's left healthcare experts scratching their heads. How can he repeal and replace a major piece of legislation without a viable alternative already in place?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. And it's worth exploring the potential impact of his healthcare plans on different groups of Americans, especially those who rely on the Affordable Care Act for their coverage.
Definitely a lot of people could be affected.
Okay, but there's one area where Trump is unwavering in his support, and that's in vitro fertilization, or IVF.
IVF. That's interesting.
Yeah, he even calls himself the father of IVF because of his role in Alabama's IVF legislation.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he promises to push for insurance coverage or government funding for IVF.
So he's making this a priority.
It seems like it, which could make this costly procedure more accessible to couples struggling with infertility.
That would be a significant change.
It would, but will he be able to garner enough support for this initiative, especially from within his own party?
And how would this fit into his broader healthcare plans?
Those are all excellent questions, and it seems like we've only just begun to unpack the complexities of Trump's vision for his second term.
We've only just scratched the surface.
We have. But that's all for part one of this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground already, from immigration and tariffs to healthcare and the minimum wage.
It's been a whirlwind of information.
It has, but we'll be back soon with part two, where we'll delve into even more intriguing topics, like his stance on abortion, his controversial cabinet picks, and his plans for government efficiency.
Stay tuned, folks. It's going to get even more interesting.
Big much more to come. Don't go anywhere.
We'll be back in a flash.
All right, so we're back and ready to jump right back into this Trump interview. There's just so much to unpack.
Seriously, it's like a political piñata.
It is. And we left off talking about healthcare, but now let's shift gears to something that's been in the headlines a lot lately, abortion.
Oh, yeah. With Roe v. Wade overturned, it's become a state issue now.
Right. So individual states have the power to regulate or ban abortion.
Huge change.
Huge. And Trump acknowledges that, but he doesn't rule out the possibility of taking federal action.
What's he saying?
He even mentions potentially restricting abortion pills through executive action.
Oh, wow. That could have a big impact nationwide.
It could. It would definitely face legal challenges and further inflame the debate surrounding abortion.
For sure, it raises questions about the balance of power between states
Yeah.
and the federal government.
Big questions. All right, let's move on to something a little lighter. Just kidding, we're going to talk about his cabinet picks.
Oh boy, those have been generating some controversy.
Some of his choices have raised concerns about conflicts of interest and whether these people will put the country first or prioritize Trump's agenda.
What are some examples?
Well, there's Kash Patel, his nominee for FBI director.
Patel. What's the story there?
So his book actually accuses people like Biden, Clinton, even former members of Trump's own cabinet, of being part of this so-called deep state.
Deep state. Now, that's a loaded term.
It is. It's often used to describe this shadowy network within the government that's working against elected officials.
Conspiracy theory territory.
Right. So it makes you wonder what kind of FBI Director Patel would be.
Would he use his position to target these people he sees as enemies?
It's a valid concern. And then there's Tulsi Gabbard, who Trump has appointed as Director of National Intelligence.
Gabbard, she's had her own share of controversy, especially with those meetings with Assad.
Exactly. And some people worry that she's too sympathetic to authoritarian leaders.
And that her appointment could signal a shift towards a more isolationist foreign policy?
Possibly. And we can't forget about RFK Jr., who's been tapped to head the Department of Government Efficiency.
RFK Jr., wow, he's been a vocal critic of vaccines, hasn't he?
He has, which has made him a controversial figure, to say the least.
And there are concerns about potential conflicts of interest, given his family's ties to the pharmaceutical industry.
Right. So can he effectively lead an agency tasked with making the government more efficient?
And will his personal views on vaccines affect his policy decisions?
Those are the big questions. And speaking of government efficiency, this new department is being spearheaded by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy.
Talk about a power duo.
Seriously, it's an interesting combination for sure.
What are they planning to do?
Well, their main goal seems to be cutting federal spending.
That's usually a popular platform.
Trump assures us he won't touch Medicare or Social Security, just make them more efficient, but I'm skeptical.
It's easy to say you'll cut waste and improve efficiency, but the reality is often much more complicated.
I agree. And here's another interesting thing. Remember Project 2025, that conservative policy blueprint that Trump distanced himself from during the campaign?
Yeah, that was a big document outlining all sorts of proposals for a Republican president.
Right. Well, now he's appointing people who were involved in Project 2025 to important positions in his administration.
So is he changing his tune?
It seems like maybe he was just being strategic during the campaign and always intended to implement some of these ideas.
It's possible either way. It looks like Project 2025 will have a significant impact on his second term.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. Okay, let's talk social media now.
Can't escape it these days.
No way, it's everywhere, and Trump has always been a master of using it to his advantage.
Oh yeah, he loves Twitter.
Love Twitter. But in this interview, he talks about TikTok, the platform he tried to ban during his first term.
Because of those concerns about ties to China.
Right. He was worried about national security risks and user data being shared with the Chinese government.
And now?
Now he seems to have changed his mind. He actually acknowledges that TikTok played a key role in his campaign's success.
Seriously?
Yeah, he even credits TikTok Jack with helping him win over young voters.
Who's TikTok Jack?
I'm assuming he means Jack Dorsey, the former CEO of Twitter.
Interesting. So he's acknowledging the power of TikTok?
He is. He even says he won the youth vote by a large margin thanks to the platform.
But what about those national security concerns he had before?
He still expresses concern about potential Chinese ownership and the possibility of social media monopolies.
So he's still a bit wary.
It seems like it, but he's also recognizing the influence of TikTok.
It's a complicated relationship for sure.
It is. And while we're on the topic of complicated things, we can't forget about the 2020 election.
Oh boy, that's still a sensitive subject.
It is, and Trump is still making claims about a stolen election, even though there's no evidence to support his allegations.
Which continues to divide the country and undermine trust in the electoral process.
It's a dangerous game he's playing. Okay, let's take a break from politics for a moment and talk about Trump's family.
Okay. Little personal touch.
He briefly mentions the 2 assassination attempts against him.
Wow, that's a sobering reminder of the risks that come with being president.
It is, and he expresses confidence in the Secret Service. He also talks about Melania and her potential role as First Lady. He praises her Be Best campaign.
That focused on issues like cyberbullying and opioid abuse.
Right, and he highlights her popularity.
But he doesn't say much about her policy involvement or what her priorities would be.
Not really. It's a bit of a mystery.
What about his children? Will they be involved in a second term?
He mentions that they did a good job, but were treated unfairly by the media.
He's always been protective of his family.
He has, and he seems to be suggesting that they won't have formal roles this time around.
So no more Ivanka in the West Wing.
Probably not. He tells them to go have fun and stay out of the political spotlight.
Maybe they're relieved.
Possibly. But it makes you wonder if their absence will affect his decision-making.
They were key advisors during his first term.
They were, so it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out. Okay, last but not least, we come to Trump's message to those who didn't vote for him.
What does he say to them?
He emphasizes his commitment to treating everyone equally and focusing on the success and safety of the country.
Sounds like a message of unity.
Does he even suggest that success will bring the country together?
It's a hopeful message, but can he deliver on that promise?
That's the big question. His actions and rhetoric have often been divisive.
It's true. So many people are skeptical about his ability to bridge the partisan divide.
For sure, it's a tall order, but maybe he's learned from his first term and is genuinely committed to bringing the country together.
We'll have to wait and see.
All right, so we spent 2 whole episodes now really digging deep into this Trump interview, and it's been a wild ride.
It has lots of twists and turns.
Definitely. But now it's time to try to connect the dots and figure out what it all means.
All right, what's the big picture here?
Exactly. So one thing that really stood out was Trump's unwavering belief in tariffs.
Oh, yeah. He loves those tariffs.
He does. He sees them as the solution to all sorts of problems like trade imbalances, economic competition, even paying down the national debt.
But is that realistic?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Economists have been debating the pros and cons of tariffs for years.
Some argue they can protect domestic industries and create jobs.
Like he said about Whirlpool and those washing machine jobs in Ohio.
Right. But others worry that tariffs could lead to trade wars, raise prices for consumers, and ultimately hurt the global economy.
So it's a risky strategy.
It is a gamble, for sure.
And speaking of gambles, his immigration plans also seem pretty risky.
Mass deportation ending birthright citizenship. Those are huge undertakings.
Massive. And they raise a lot of logistical and ethical questions.
Like, is it even possible to deport millions of people?
And is it morally right to uproot families who've built lives here regardless of their legal status?
Tough question.
They are. And there's healthcare. He promises affordable coverage with protections for pre-existing conditions.
But he's vague on the details.
Very vague. He keeps talking about repealing and replacing Obamacare, but we haven't seen a real alternative plan yet.
So how is he going to achieve that?
Yeah.
It's unclear.
It is. And then there's his focus on IVF funding. That was a surprise.
It was. But will he get enough support for that, especially from his own party?
And how does that fit into his overall healthcare vision? It's a puzzle.
Lots of pieces to put together.
Okay, now let's talk foreign policy that's always interesting with Trump.
Unpredictable.
Exactly.
Huh.
He's got this mix of America First nationalism, skepticism towards traditional alliances, and a love of personal diplomacy.
So what does that mean in practice?
Well, he talks about reducing foreign aid, renegotiating trade deals, getting tough with adversaries.
But he's also ambiguous on some key issues like Taiwan and NATO.
Which creates uncertainty and could destabilize things globally.
So a bit of a wild card.
That's one way to put it. And then there are those controversial cabinet picks, like Kash Patel and RFK Jr.
Those appointments raised a lot of eyebrows.
They did. People are worried about conflicts of interest and potential biases.
Will they put the country first or serve their own agendas?
That's the million-dollar question. And finally, there's the question of unity.
Can Trump bring the country together?
He says he wants to, but his actions and rhetoric often suggest otherwise.
His claims about a stolen election and his attacks on opponents haven't helped.
They haven't. It's hard to see how he can unite the country when he's constantly dividing it.
That's a real challenge.
So where does all this leave us? We've analyzed Trump's vision for a second term, explored his policies, and considered the potential consequences.
A lot to think about.
There is, but now it's time for you, the listener, to reflect on what all this means for you.
How might these policies, these global shifts, these leadership choices affect your life, your community, your future?
These are the big questions we want you to ponder.
And remember, this deep dive was just a starting point. There's so much more to learn and explore.
Exactly. So stay curious. Stay engaged and keep asking those tough questions.
That's what we're all about here at The Deep Dive.
We want to empower you with knowledge, encourage critical thinking, and spark meaningful conversations.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
We hope you found it informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit entertaining.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
See you on the next Deep Dive.